welcome to Varn Vlog, and today I'm here with Adnan Husain, historian, co-host of Guerrilla History, co-host of the Malas.
The Muchless.
Muslims. I always screw up Arabic words, and you wouldn't think I would, because that's a term from North Africa that I should be able to say. Um, the Muslims podcast, and we are talking today about the kind of long Duree history of the Mediterranean world. And I think we're going to go into Henri Perrin and the kind of standard view of the late antiquity, although I'm going to preemptively complicate that about how I got so interested in this. I started asking myself a question a long time ago, I think about 15 years ago. Why did we consider the ancient Greek world European? Because it didn't really make that much sense to me that we did. I was like, well, like most of it's technically in Anatolia, which is in Asia. It overlaps with the Semitic world, which is North Africa and the Levant. A lot of key Greek philosophers were in Libya. I mean, like, it just doesn't make, and definitely Alexandria. So, my first inclination was that it was a conspiracy by the British and the Germans in the 19th century, which I still kind of believe.
Don't forget the Germans.
Yeah.
They were keen on a Greek genealogy for their own enlightened late 18th and early 19th century works. So,
yeah, well, when you start noticing the particular German obsession with like claiming the Greeks, and you go, well, okay, why are they doing that? Like, that doesn't make that much sense, because the Greek world has very little to do with the, Romanic world. And then you go and look at, oh, but the British have claimed the Romans. Okay, so this is what we got. And these are late nationalist projects. I mean, in the German case, I think they're kind of middle nationalist projects, but that answers part of the question. And I think that gets us back to the other part of the question is Henri Perrin kind of set up this in the way that he constructs the end of late antiquity and the beginning into what we might call the early Middle Ages. A time period that has obsessed me. I've become obsessed with because I can't explain it. Like most historiography, I attempt to sit down with it. I find somewhat frustrating. You have, I don't know, this morning I was reading about Harald Hardrada, right? Harald Hardrada, big Norwegian Viking guy, almost took over England.
right.
Got his ass kicked by Harold Godwinson, and then who himself got his butt kicked by another French Viking, William the Conqueror.
Exactly.
But you sit down with Hardrada and you're like, okay, but he's like, okay, over in the Rus, and then wait, he's in Byzantium and he's over in the Levant, and then he comes back to Norway. What?
Mm-hmm.
And so you realize that this idea that just because the Roman Empire went away, that these people, and also that's got to be in quotation marks too, because Byzantium is the Roman Empire, but just because the Roman Empire went away in scare quotes, that these people weren't encountering all kinds of different groups of people, and that they were in relatively staid enclaves. It's just not true at all. So I guess that leads us to what I might like to call the sins of Henri Perrin. But we need to talk about what he actually believed, because he is the person who basically creates our historical understanding of what the European early Middle Ages are. So what's Perrin's ideas?
Well, I mean, I think you started with a really wonderful question about why we think of the Greeks as Europe, and how this gets, the inheritance and legacy of the ancient world gets parceled out and both geographically and temporally, redivided in kind of creative ways that are products of historiography and sense of historical identity that are much anti-dating, post-dating the actual phenomenon. And that's why this period has fascinated so many people, because people feel like they can understand a coherent narrative about what the ancient world was. Now, unfortunately, I think even that approach has typically, if you're looking at Gibbon and, these other 19th century style grand historical, or Toynbee, or, these grand historians who created these grand narratives, they have perhaps a limited understanding in some ways of the ancient world and the interconnections that took place, in that period. And we tend to think of the Greek, and then later, especially the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, and then the Roman Empire as somehow a self-contained sort of entity, rather than just a very large political structure that integrated trade networks and had contact with polities in other parts of the world, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or parts of West Asia, and so on. So we have this idea that it's this integrated period. But in any case, it's true that the Romans thought of the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our lake, our sea, because they had control over the shores around the Mediterranean. But when, that fragmentation starts to take place, the question is how does the end come? What is the meaning of the end? Is the end of the Roman Empire fundamentally just a political, fragmentation, or does something else fundamentally change? Somebody like Henri Pirenne was actually coming up with a very counter view, actually. The classic narrative was that these Germanic invaders from Northern Europe overwhelmed Rome. And the wars that the Romans had fought against the Germans, finally, it exhausted itself, and population pressures and other kinds of decline of military power ended up leading to migrations taking place from Northern Europe into the Mediterranean world, and that you end up having the collapse of the Roman Empire because of German conquest, the fall of Rome, and that the survival of the Roman Empire is something that takes place in the East when, Constantine and others re-establish a new capital, Constantinople, and the Eastern Roman Empire. It continues and it becomes known as the Byzantine Empire. But in the West, there is no longer a Roman Empire, and it's because of the Germanic invasions. And Pirenne thought this was misunderstanding the consequences and effects of the Germanic invasions. Because he was somebody who was moving away from purely politically oriented analyses of history to take into account, rather innovatively, you would have to say, during this period, socio and economic history in particular, he argued that the political collapse of the Roman Empire really didn't alter the fundamental structural conditions of the integration of the Mediterranean world through long-distance trade that he argued continued, after the Germanic invasions. And his thesis was that the Germans really acculturated themselves to Romanitas. It was a process. It was going to take some time. But here were barbarians who understood that Rome was a superior, civic, urban, complex civilization that produced all of this monumental architecture, art, and, literate society and culture. And so they tried to style themselves somehow in terms that would be regarded as legitimate by the people they had militarily conquered, and characterize themselves as continuators of Rome in one fashion or another, adopting Roman titles, continuing aspects of Roman administration, and fundamentally they didn't disrupt the what Perrin would argue was the more fundamental integrating effect of long distance trade across the Mediterranean, that you still see papyri, indicating transactions and exchanges being used in southern France, in northern Italy during this period, despite the German control. And you have testimonies of Syrian merchants and Jewish merchants operating, across the Mediterranean. So his perspective was politics is an epiphenomenon. And even in that case, what you have is this attempt at assimilation or acculturation to Romanitas that meant that by the time you have Justinian, the emperor in the East, in the 5th century, there is a process of re-Romanization of the Mediterranean starting to take place with the expansion of imperial law, new territories being reintegrated, or territories being reintegrated into the eastern half, and that it was in the process of reconstituting at the political level what never really fundamentally changed in the Mediterranean, which was the unity of the Mediterranean world economically and socially. But the process gets interrupted and disrupted not by the Germanic invasions, but by the Arab conquests, the Arab Muslim conquests of the 7th century. That, he argues, ends up dividing the Mediterranean and splitting it into separate, incompatible worlds. And you have the fragmentation of the Mediterranean world. And that as a result and as a consequence of this, which he argues is the most important set of events in the history of the West since the Punic Wars. Okay, so the important conquest of Carthage by Rome that ends up making Rome the dominant political force and integrating by defeating its great rival and enemy in the Mediterranean, the North African, from what is today, would be Tunisia, Carthage and its empire. They're defeated, and that creates the Roman world and the integration of the Mediterranean. He thinks the second most important thing that ever happened in Western history, and you could say from his perspective, global history, because that's what matters to him, was the Arab Muslim conquests that split this Mediterranean, that was a unified world, and forces a new pathway of development that emphasizes the Germanic kind of Franco-German world of Charlemagne. And so his famous thesis, where he put a series of articles together, he put it into a book form that was actually published after his death, was this book called Mahomet et Charlemagne, Muhammad and Charlemagne. And in a nutshell, his thesis is, if no Muhammad, you get no Charlemagne, and you don't get the Latin West developing into the Europe that we know, that is built upon the ladder of Carolingian civilization and the Holy Roman Empire and the Latin Church, and this kind of world that turns away from the Mediterranean is built upon these other foundations. And, what he has to try and explain here, he tries to adduce this on the basis of some of the material evidence. He says, trade was disrupted, and that is the real problem. But the really important problem for him is that he says, he asks essentially a question: why did these barbarians not assimilate the way the Germanic barbarians did? And he basically comes up with a really nice Orientalist view that authorizes this real kind of clash of civilization imagination of these separate worlds by saying, well, it's Islam that prevented them from actually being absorbed into the conditions and standards and identities and languages of the Mediterranean world, and that they refused to assimilate to the higher culture and civilization because Islam prevented them. And he says very interestingly we can see this even today. I believe it's in a footnote in this. Where he says it's even today where, you can see that in North Africa and in all of these different colonies, where France has its civilizational mission, that Islam prevents these, people from assimilating into, French culture and French civilization. So just as then it prevented them from Romanizing and maintaining the unity of the Mediterranean world, it, even today is something that prevents their assimilation to Western society and culture because it's completely incompatible. And so that's his thesis, that basically, because of the Muslim conquests, you have this disruption of the Mediterranean world, and it impels a particular path of development that Europe takes that gives us the European Middle Ages and eventually Europe as the secularized form of the Latin West, which is Europe, Western Europe, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, Henri Pirenne is definitely one of those cases of 2 steps forward, 85 steps back. No, it's, I mean, in so much that I think his correction on what's going on with the Germanic peoples is actually fundamentally true. From what I can understand from the historiography, and admittedly, most of the historiography I read is post Pirenne, so we have to take that into account. But that basically once the Asiatic steppe peoples descend and become the Germans and the Celts and whoever, by the time they are able to assume real power in the West, they're also very interested in reassessing and reestablishing Roman public legitimacy. They do it in a weird way. That there's basically polycentric systems of law where some late antique stuff is maintained and others aren't. And I mean, as a Marxist, it really messes up my neat periodizations, frankly. Like, that's why I'm obsessed with it. The other reason is because I'm like, wait, no, I don't know how I really have no idea. It seems like the antique world takes like 500 years to stop, kind of, and not evenly, and then we immediately transition into something else. So the entire period of feudalism, or manorialism, and really it's kind of both. And for people who go, what's the distinction there? It's a political distinction, but whether or not you think the manor or the relation to the Lord is actually the more important political economic unit, right? So when a lot of people hear about the arguments about feudal or there is no feudalism, they don't really, I think non-historians often, not because they can't, because it's not explained to them, don't understand what's at stake there, right? When we talk about Western Europe, we're like, well, feudalism is about fealty to individual lords, and manorialism is about these manors that developed because of weird tax policy at the end of the Roman Empire. And both of them kind of coexist in both Merovingian and Carolingian France. I'm putting that in quotations too. Because talking about France and England before the 13th century is sort of anachronistic. It's a little bit easier in the case of England because you do have unified polity kind of in the bottom half of the Isles, but nonetheless, like trying to figure out what like the exact line between like a petty king and a duke will take you. You could write multiple dissertations on it.
Indeed.
And so my point is that it's super messy, but it also misses like this idea that Islam comes up and basically makes the Arabs not Greek or something. Or I'm always trying to figure out exactly how they're conceiving this here. Because for me, it causes 2 problems immediately. One, that doesn't really explain the difference between the Greek world that wasn't part of the Islamicate world in the Eastern Roman Empire, aka the Byzantine Empire, which does not play well with the West pretty much ever. I mean, there's some formalities with Ravenna that people try to maintain, but like in general, they basically just write it off as there be annoying barbarian dragons and let the Franks deal with it. And then you have the problem of, well, if it was that big a deal, why am I finding like coins minted in Mercia for trade with Islamic, with his, with the Islamicate world through the Byzantine trade routes in the 9th century, if it totally cut everything off? I mean, that's
right.
Like that little bit of just coinage really hurts that narrative. So what do we think was actually going on?
Right, right. Well, that's two excellent points. And I want to say that I think one thing that I do sort of agree with Perrin is that ultimately the Latin West does develop in certain distinctive ways. Now, I wouldn't argue that it's causally produced just by the, Arab Muslim invasions that impose some kind of, division upon the Mediterranean, as if, there isn't any interaction and commerce and so on. It's not that it gets cut off, that there are other, I would argue it's the way it's integrated, okay, into the Mediterranean world is partly what produces its unique direction. And there's two things here to say, is that the real kind of populous, urban, artistic and craft and technical developments, in what survives these waves of disruption and invasion by the 8th, 9th century are in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And that's either in the Byzantine, Eastern Roman or surviving Roman Empire, or in, these settled cities of the Near East, North Africa. And so these are where, trade and manufacture, textiles, these kinds of industries, soap making, glass making, all of these things are developed to a great extent. And as a result of these kinds of manufactures and the intermediate position that West Asia has for trade routes integrating the Indian Ocean world, and from maritime perspectives, and overland from the Silk routes and those sorts of trade routes that go to the Far East, that as a result it was a very prosperous and important and powerful kind of sub-region, linking Europe and the rest of the Mediterranean world to South Asia and the Far East. And so Europe's position during this period is of providing essentially raw materials, right? So what it can produce during this time period and provide is not like the finished textiles. If you want to think of economic organization, think of textile making as the highest stage of industrial development, that you would have in the pre-modern world. It's like the petroleum economy, it's, mastery of that is really kind of the high tech, of its time, and very important because it's just so important for clothing, for rugs, tapestries, for bags, making things, holding things. You either have leather or you have woven, kind of textiles that are used as containers and things like that. So it was very important. That's not happening during this stage. It will start to happen, of course. And we know, of course, in our Marxist histories of industrialization that it is, in fact, the textile mills, right, in Birmingham and places like that in central England that are so important in the transformations that take place in early capitalism. So, but what is Europe contributing during this period economically? It is timber, furs, some metals, that can be mined, metals, and people, slaves. Right. Okay, so labor. They are, basically what you see. And Michael McCormick, a great historian of the early Middle Ages, who wrote a fantastic, like 800-page account of the early medieval economy basically argues that what Europe has to offer during this period is the highest value commodity it can provide to the Mediterranean world is slaves. And this happens with raiding taking place. Charlemagne, is constantly fighting against these pagans and Saxony and Slavs, and this is the word. This is the reason why the word Slav is the word for slave. Is basically it was a kind of ethnic designation of those who were non-Christians who were subject to raiding and enslavement and taking captives and being sold and circulated in the great capitals, of the Mediterranean world, whether it's Cordoba, Byzantium, Constantinople, or Cairo, or Damascus, or Baghdad, right? So this is kind of fundamentally important to understand, and this is also what helps explain why there are coins. There clearly was lots of interchange taking place either through the North Sea. Via the Rus and down into West Asia, or from the Mediterranean coasts, into as I said, these other major cities around the Mediterranean world, mostly in the southern and eastern part of the Mediterranean. So these coins that we find in these hoards, these Abbasid coins, these beautiful Kufic script coins from the 8th, 9th century, and also exemplars of coins that are clearly imitations of Abbasid coins that are made. There's the famous Knut dinar, which is basically something that he gives as a gift to the Pope, as an example of luxury and imperial kind of munificence and grandeur. Is basically their image of it is, a copy of an Abbasid gold dinar, with fake Arabic, impressed into it. This is because this was the emblem of the highest standards of value coming from the wealthy sectors of the Mediterranean world and circulating when they had the commodities that were needed or necessary, like timber, furs, metals, and above all, slaves. So that's one component that contravenes Peren's thesis that there's just now a kind of void of long distance trade. And so many economic historians have suggested that the thesis is wrong on the basis of his economic analysis. But we do want to point out that he was a pioneer in doing this. So I think it's a very interesting point to note that his thesis is a way of integrating and justifying doing socioeconomic history, which we regard as a very progressive step towards looking beyond constitutional law, the lives and decisions of, great, military figures and kings and so on, to actually looking at socioeconomic dimensions of society. However, it was predicated for him entirely on really marking Europe off from the wider world in which it clearly was also a part. So that's at the level of economy. I think the other component that people might be interested in is thinking of, cross-cultural relations. And, one thing that you find is that in the pre-Crusade period, while there, of course, are hostile, portrayals of any of the various invaders and attackers, be they Arabs in the Mediterranean or Vikings on, the northern shore and coasts, whether it's in northern France, England, and so on, is that everyone was, worried about these marauding raiders. And the Arabs during this period had developed real maritime capabilities. And so in addition to the land conquests that went across North Africa, and by the early 8th century meant that the process of conversion, conquest, and subsequently conversion of the peoples of North Africa was starting to take place. Already by the early 8th century, Arab Muslims, now combined Arab and Berber armies, are starting to play a role in the politics of Visigothic Spain. And so you start to have these encounters taking place. And of course, Gibraltar, the rock of Tariq, it's Jabal at-Tariq, is named Gibraltar because that was the launching point for Tariq, who was a commander of Arab and Berber forces in what is today Morocco, to cross over at the invitation, interestingly enough, of one of the Visigothic partisans for control in a sort of civil succession contestation, invites Tariq's forces to come help him, Julian in this case, to secure the throne. And so that's when they cross over and then are successful. And as a result of other kinds of machinations that take place, they end up being able to seize control independently at a certain point. And you have the establishment of the first Muslim emirate on what now would be considered European territory, and that is, of course, Al-Andalus, or medieval, Spain. Al-Andalus just being the Arab name for the land that is established, or the polity that's established, and polities that are established in what is today the Iberian Peninsula. And of course, they managed to, over the course of the next few decades, expand their political power and control over most of the peninsula, and even to conduct raiding parties across the Pyrenees, which leads to the famous Battle of Tours or Poitiers, where Charles Martel famously prevented the scholars of Oxford, according to Gibbon, from having to be Muslims speaking Arabic, right? So this is kind of how he characterizes this as a sort of decisive clash of civilizations. It really wasn't anything more than a kind of minor skirmish by a raiding party. And these raiding parties were going all over, across the Pyrenees. They end up establishing on the southern coast in what is today very close to Saint-Tropez, on the Côte d'Azur and the French Riviera, a small polity by capturing a kind of hill fortress, which is called Fraxinatum, and establishing a kind of frontier state there that existed from, I think, about 887 to, I'm a historian, but I'm admittedly always very bad with remembering all of the dates, but I believe it's something like, which is a cardinal sin, but about 887 to 972. So something like almost a century, you have a frontier state established by Arab Berber Muslims from Spain in what is today southern France, conducting raids into, Otto, the first of Germany's territory, and Burgundy, parts of, Carolingian territory in, central France, and the eastern kind of coastline and areas on the other side of the Italian Alps in the Italian peninsula. And, somebody as important a chronicler as Liutprand of Cremona, talks extensively about, this group and the threats that they pose to some of the, surrounding areas. You also have conquest, that takes place also in the 9th century of Sicily, which had been under Byzantine control, and there are constantly, provincial commanders and governors who are trying to break away. So this is all very contested. It's not always fully under the control of the Byzantine emperor. Much of southern Italy and Sicily is being contested by local commanders. And in this context, just as we saw in Spain, some of these princes and counts and local commanders often will make common cause and invite the Arab Muslim forces to join them, make some kind of alliance or an agreement to fight against their overlords. The popes have a great deal of difficulty because a lot of the nobility in southern Italy end up collaborating with Muslims, and they establish another kind of small frontier polity that isn't defeated until 915. I mean, it's also there for the Battle of Garigliano. Pope John X himself personally tried to organize Christian forces to actually band together and stop supporting and allying with the Arab Muslim forces here in central Italy, and end up defeating them finally after several generations where there is a presence on the Italian peninsula. So this period basically of the 8th and 9th centuries is one where the entire Mediterranean world is subject to Byzantine forces attempting to reassert control, sometimes being thrown out, Arab forces, Arab and Berber Muslim forces from North Africa expanding through the Iberian Peninsula or in the Mediterranean and Sicily and southern Italy and along the French coastline, acting much like the Vikings did, sometimes raiding and attacking monasteries, which were poorly defended, but also repositories of great wealth. And you also have the Germanic groups, whether the Lombards or the Carolingians, also trying to consolidate power and control. And you have at least three-way, kinds of internecine kind of conflicts taking place where there isn't a real public order and a real integrated sort of state system during this period. But I would just conclude by saying that although you have cases where partisans of the Pope will decry the fact that these are Saracens, as they call them, i.e., and they usually think of them as pagans. They don't always recognize that Islam is a new monotheistic religion, but they understand that there might be some religious difference, and they characterize the need to protect Christians against these Saracens. But most of the time, they're just talked about as one among any set of possible invaders, many of whom are, non-Christians, like the Vikings. And they're often described more about where they were from, or what their dynastic name was, whether they're the Aghlabids or they're coming from North Africa or they're coming from Spain. And it's not polarized in the same kind of confessional language that we would imagine contributes to some broader consciousness of a clash of civilizations, a war of religions. This is something that's invented, I think, a little bit later, with the Crusades. And during this period, we don't see either a knowledge about Islam and Muslims that highlights their religious difference, or a confessionalization, a pure confessionalization of military conflict between the number of warring groups contesting power, raiding, capturing people, plundering, along the Mediterranean coasts during this period.
Yeah, well, this, this brings up all kinds of things when we talk about the transition to from the quote ancient to the modern world, which we kind of label, the High Middle Ages, the feudal period, etc. One of the things I noticed is, I always talked about the Christian shaped hole in whiteness that was constructed largely in the 14th, 15th century after particularly after the religious wars within Christendom. But then I kind of realized myself that Christendom maybe existed for 150 years. Like it was one of these things that you realize, oh yeah, there's a unified confessional church that's kind of doing something administrative after the fall of the Roman state in the West, kind of, and seems to be a cultural. It seems to be a semi-cultural unifying force. Semi in that I don't know if you could make even the Christian, like when you started Christianizing Vikings, you still couldn't make them like recognize the bishops they were supposed to or whatever. I remember like Harold Hardrada like telling the German bishops to go screw themselves. And also that when you're dealing in the peripheries of Europe, which would be where the Germanic and Scandinavian peoples are, you're dealing with peoples who, you know, they'll convert to Christianity, but they'll also do like 100 human sacrifices to Odin too. I mean, like it like they're hedging their bets. So you realize that Christendom is really, it isn't like it was established as a successor to the Roman Empire and then fell with the fall of Byzantium, which is kind of the way that I was taught it. That no, it was kind of established to get these successor states to the Carolingians to play along under one political order, which didn't really work that well either, because also, oh my god, the number of anti-popes and stuff you're dealing with during this time period. It's just like, it's like there's 4 popes or something now, like
as if one wasn't enough.
Right, exactly. So you have a polycentric order that can't even keep its separate centers together. But that the Crusades seem to serve. I mean, and I tend to have an economic view of what the Crusades are. There's 2 things going on there. You have the Europe finally being established for more than just slaving ground, for all different kinds of groups. Honestly, it wasn't just the Islamicate world. And you have this leading to the establishment of raw material wealth, particularly in places like England, where England is rich in, not in textiles yet, that's not going to come for another 200, 300 years, but it's rich in wool, and it's rich in silver. And which is also gets politically consolidated, which makes it a great big old giant target, because now instead of having to beat 7 petty kings, you have to beat 1 and a bridge. So you have that situation going on. I mean, I do think this kind of opaqueness leads to the modern world in an interesting sense, and something that I talk a lot about. Like, why are nation states natural to Europe? I don't really think they're all that natural to the Islamicate world even today. No. I think they're always like awkward fits. And a lot of it has to do with these consolidations in the 12th century, which overlap with religion, particularly after Byzantium falls and the Reconquista happens. Because you kind of have to make a narrative justification for that. And then you got to get rid of all these excess warlords that you've been cultivating for, since basically all governments in Europe are, as we've implied, slavery extortion rackets. You got to get them to do something other than kill all your own peasants, because what else are they going to do? And if they kill all the peasants, they don't have a labor base to supply them with their military arms. It's really self-defeating. So I don't know, go throw them at those other empires, including the Christian ones, although that you're going to use the Christian one as the excuse to do it. So, when Emperor Michael, I believe it's Michael, writes, that's the justification for the crusade. But like, the first places they raid are not Islamicate places, they're Byzantine strongholds. I mean, which definitely, like, one of the religious aims of this time period is to reunite the Eastern and Western Church, and well, the Crusades make sure that doesn't happen. So, but it does seem to solidify these nation states where they really didn't have solidification. I mean, when we think about these kingdoms, we tend to try to read them as modern nation states, but
Right.
they're not. I
No.
mean, like,
Yeah.
they don't really have central apparatuses. There's no unifying language. They're not even concerned about ethnic unity and who they're ruling. They see pretty much everybody as a tax farm. I mean, it does lead to some of that has interesting side effects, like the Doomsday Book, which is basically the most, logistically impressive tax farming book that ever existed. But nonetheless, that's what you end up with. I think it's interesting because it means that Christendom is a thing that basically exists only as a way of consolidating these polities that they can't consolidate otherwise. So these empires don't congeal. The Carolingian Empire is not able to congeal. The Holy Roman Empire has always kind of been a joke. I mean, in so much that, I mean, the old joke is it's neither holy nor Roman, which has always been true, but also was always kind of a joke. And one of the things that brings me back to Perrin is this project in the 19th and 20th, early 20th century to be like, Europe is a distinct culture, and we totally didn't become world dominant just by accident or anything. And that's got to be read as part of the project here, which leads us to misunderstand the relations between the Islamic world, or the Islamicate world, and the West. I do think there is a meaningful distinction between the post-Latin West and the West. I mean, I agree with you, but it's a weird distinction, and its relationship to Rome is only as like a fig leaf of legitimization later. And it even shows up in the like weirdness of proto-national myths of identity. I mean, like when we look at Arthuriana, which has a weird relationship to Rome, and also a weird relationship to like British national identity, even because it's a British national myth that's constructed by the French and the Welsh. Like it's it's a very strange thing when you actually start thinking about that. You're like, so it's a British national myth constructed by the British and the Melf, reading 13th century norms onto the 6th century, which is crazy, but only sometimes and not in coherent way. Like, and you start seeing that they're really having a problem with legitimization. It's interesting too, because I think the other thing that we have to like look at with the fall of Andalusia is when that's often discussed, people miss how destabilizing the same thing that's taking out the Byzantines was actually to the Islamicate world, because it's not like the Seleucids and the Ottomans were like long-standing caliphates that were just chill in Baghdad for 1,000 years prior or whatever. Like it's, or let's be more historical, like 500 years. They're new on the game for everybody. And they're kind of destabilizing in the region too. And then you have these other Asian steppe peoples. And I mean, you want to complicate everyone's narrative, start talking about what Asian steppe peoples have done to produce both North Africa and Europe. But you have these other Asian steppe peoples converting, and that's making massive shifts to these polities in the Mediterranean world. And I think the idea that all these groups were inherently at odds really does lead us to not understand how we got here. And it leads to weird narratives, like another example, the Renaissance. I was like, oh, well, we finally started talking to Arabs again, and that's why we got all of our Greek classics back. What? Like, I mean, like, you start realizing, no, there's references to Arabic scholarship in the West, like in the 11th century. Um, it's all over the place, actually, if you start really looking for it. So it also doesn't enable us to understand like what did happen. I mean, there is some truth that, yeah, like philosophy in the Islamicate world, you know, it kind of meant Aristotle, but uh, but it had done a better job of maintaining, you know, Aristotelian and Neoplatonic text. It had incorporated that into contemporary debates way before the Europeans did. And you know, the first thing that you really see in the precursor to the Enlightenment is like both acknowledging that and also trying to erase it simultaneously. So you got like you know, how much like I don't know, Al-Kindi is actually in Thomas Aquinas. It's also like trying to be removed simultaneously, so we don't have to acknowledge that there's Al-Kindi in Thomas Aquinas. And you know, you see that quite a bit.
Yeah, that, I mean, there's I do want to pick up on that because it gets us back to that original question, which is like, how is it that like the Greeks become the progenitors of Europe? Because, you know, it's a rather circuitous route here that the Greek science, math, and philosophy takes, you know, on its road to, you know, apparently where it always needed to end up, which is, you know, being reclaimed.
Germany.
Yeah, right. You know, to the extent that actually Al-Jahiz, who's a very interesting figure, it's a nickname, you know, sort of a literary nickname. It means the bug-eyed guy, you know. He was this, this belles-lettres theologian, literary writer in Iraq in the 9th century. And this is, of course, the apex and high point, you might say, of the Abbasid Empire, when Baghdad was probably the largest city in the world outside of China, sometimes thought to have 1 million, you know, people. And there was being sponsored a very vibrant intellectual culture of studying Greek scholars. Translations were being made under the patronage of the Abbasid Caliph, starting as early as the 750s. And then, of course, you know, culminating, and it started with like astronomical and astrological works. But, you know, continued in translation of Galen and eventually translation of Aristotle's works and so on. First into Syriac, a kind of another Semitic language spoken indigenously by the Christian communities of Iraq and Syria, and then from Syriac, you know, into Arabic, and then sometimes directly from Greek into Arabic. And more than just translations of Euclid, Ptolemy, Aristotle, and Galen, you know, foundational figures. There was continuous development. This was a living tradition where they would continue to develop along the same lines, often using close observational techniques, empiricism, to critique these theories, extend them, develop new theories, and so on. So it wasn't a kind of inert, let's translate and then study these great masters, but rather let's continue the process of studying our world and trying to understand the motion of the stars and so on. And so you do have a very vibrant intellectual culture, which is important to recognize, because when the second great translation movement takes place in transmitting this Greek tradition of philosophy and science from Arabic into Latin, the Latin scholars are equally interested in the Arab continuation, the Arab and Persian, some of whom were Christian, some of whom were Jewish, many of whom were Muslim, but those who continued this tradition and developed it in Arabic, they were interested in like you would be today. You would be interested in whatever the latest, best science is. They wanted the most up-to-date understandings and theories. And they absorbed the fact that the Arabs were willing to sometimes differ from, the Greek masters, and also developed a kind of tradition of empirical notation. So they took a lot of observations. They built observatories, and then they took, measurements and recorded their observations over 100 years, of celestial movement and arrangement of the stars. And on that basis, there were people who critiqued things like, the Ptolemaic, or tried to adjust and correct the Ptolemaic, kind of geocentric, system of understanding perfect spheres, and so on. And so when we talk about Europe's beginning 12th century Renaissance, that was the basis for a subsequent, more popularly called Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries, it was being built on foundations of recovering ancient knowledge, but also contemporary knowledge that had been established in, the Islamicate worlds. When these translations were being made from Arabic into Latin, they also went typically through a mediating language, that of Romance, whatever was being spoken, Spanish, like Proto-Spanish. And there were kinds of collaborative teams where a Latin translator who took all the credit usually didn't talk about the fact that they had a Mozarab or a Jewish collaborator who happened to know Arabic and Spanish and could translate the Arabic into Spanish, so that the, Robert of Ketton or the Herman of Dalmatia or the Gundisalvus, could take it from Spanish essentially into Latin and put it into good Latin, and then take credit for translating the text. That's a very similar process by which they are dependent clearly on the Arabs, on the authority of the Arabic texts, but at the same time, they don't want to, really acknowledge and give credit to the fact that it's a collective process of transmission, rather than just great scholars like Adelard of Bath showing up and, being able to read all the Arabic texts and transmit this knowledge. So it's important to kind of understand the actual historical process by which this so-called recovery of European knowledge comes back to Europe, is not just through the medium of Arabic that preserved it, but actually a tradition. What we see in the Mediterranean is an interreligious, cross-cultural, project of science and philosophy that's engaged in by people from around the Mediterranean. And that is the way it should be looked at. And that's exactly analogous, in my sense, to what we've been trying to do by critiquing this perennial idea of the divided world, of separate and hostile camps that have nothing in relationship to one another. Instead, one can look at the Islamic world, and this is a great thesis I would recommend. It's an old book now, but I feel like it made a very important contribution, is Garth Fowden's Empire to Commonwealth, The Consequences of Monotheism. And he tries to argue that actually the transition from the ancient world to the medieval, this period of late antiquity, extends a lot longer than we tend to think of it, and that it goes into the 7th and 8th centuries, and that Islam and the Islamic world is really the kind of outcome, you might say, of a process by which there were attempts to try and reconcile essentially new theological changes and forms of organization of religion, of religious culture, i.e. monotheism, with forms of large-scale political integration, that is empire. And he didn't call it this, but I would say, is that what you end up seeing happening is the emergence of what we could think of as confessional empires. That is, empires that have an official confessional form of monotheistic religion, although I don't think theologically the monotheism is actually what's most important. What's most important is that it's a kind of total system, that can be the official religion of a state and provide this kind of integrative sort of function. And you see Constantine is clearly attempting to do something like that. He wasn't able to achieve it. You could say that in some sense, the Muslim caliphates are, through the Umayyad and especially the Abbasid caliphates, are the fulfillment of this vision, essentially, of bringing together a universalist kind of empire with, confessional form of religion. And that has real consequences on the whole pattern of Mediterranean history, where people are trying to kind of achieve things somewhat similar. The Latin West is its own quirky sort of attempt, first with Charlemagne and then subsequent Holy Roman emperors. But you've got this problem of, temporal versus spiritual authority with the universal church, and it's,
you literally have 2 or 3 completely separate systems of law, which I mean, the Islamicate world also has separate systems of law, but they actually have a framework for dealing with that.
Yeah, that's right. That there are ways to resolve the problems there. Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, you end up having this kind of, and you were alluding to it essentially earlier, that these investiture conflicts and so on that end up making all kinds of convulsions in the 11th and 12th century, and leads to this reformed papacy and conflicts with the Holy Roman Emperor and so on, and that constantly are dividing. You still have, however, essentially an attempt to try and create some sort of universalistic form. It doesn't succeed, and that's essentially how the nation-state system emerges. The proto-states of England and France and so on, that the universalizing umbrella is under the authority of the Pope, where the popes, are recognized and their authority is respected. You end up having a kind of subordinate state system to that, but that is legitimized essentially by, the papal decree. And so I think there is something to this kind of idea that, you have commonwealths in the medieval period on either side of the Mediterranean that, structurally speaking, have differences, but follow something like a similar pattern. And again, what it emphasizes to me is how much this world of the Mediterranean is a place of meeting between different cultures who are essentially involved in the same kinds of projects, rather than clashes. And they're rivals with one another, and there's all kinds of conflicts, but they're not clashes of civilizations, in the way that Perrin or Huntington imagines them, but they are things that unfold historically according to the logics of Mediterranean interchange, contact, and interrelations with one another. Like for one quick example to point out how integrated it seems to me, or at least how you have to have an integrated sense of the history to really explain and understand things, is take a look at Sicily. Take a look at the case of the Normans in Sicily. Now, before the Normans, defeat, the Anglo-Saxons in Spain, the 2 heralds, right?
William the Conqueror cut his teeth on Sicily. I mean,
well, that's the point, is that before they're involved in crossing the English Channel, they're already involved in the Mediterranean. They're establishing polities in Sicily. They conquer Sicily. They conquer parts of southern France. And part of the reason, I would argue, I don't think anybody has really done, I don't really do Norman history that much, so I don't know so much about what's happening in the latest scholarship on 12th century Anglo-Norman kind of state formation. I used to be interested in that, but I haven't kept up with the scholarship on it. But I have not heard people arguing what I think is should be a pretty interesting and clear argument to make, which is that it is in some ways the contact with Greek and Arabic administrative practices, structures, bureaucracies, and so on in Sicily, that where the Normans do their most important institutional, state formation. They absorb the Arab and Greek administrators. Um, and that when they come to be successful in creating, an exchequer and creating a kind of chancery and bureaucracy and tax collecting, in England, that helps give it an advantage in centralizing, forms of political authority earlier than lots of other parts of Europe. It doesn't seem to me it's an accident that part of the family has already been involved with, more sophisticated forms of administration, tax collection, record keeping, and so on, that they've had to develop in order to govern the territories that they conquered in Arab and Greek Sicily and southern Italy. And there's been a lot of good study of Norman administration in Sicily, but I don't think that it's always connected with those who study Norman administration, in England during this time.
Yeah, that just really occurred to me. It answers a question. When I recently did a series on the Marxist medievalist S.E. Hinton.
Oh yeah.
We were talking about why is it that all the rest of the French like have an absolute kingship, but really for geographic reasons and all this other stuff, they can't administer to save their life. And so most of the French polities are actually, while theoretically centrally stronger, actually more regionally strong until like almost the 15th century. Except for the Normans,
right,
who are this weird outlier who also can't really get that to go off in France, probably for geographic reasons, honestly, but can get it to go off in England in a way that makes them outcompete nearly everybody until their primogeniture problems really screw them up. I mean, one of the things I think, we could talk about why I think Islamic polities were always more stable than the not always, but they were able to reconstitute themselves quicker than, say, Christian ones. Has to do with the way that kingship works or doesn't work. And so on one hand, I completely agree with you that there's a continuity here from Commonwealth to Empire back, and it doesn't take in Europe. That leads to confessional states that have legitimacy from the Pope, but really also have to like consolidate themselves with modern technology and printing, and even that the fact that that European international laws, a Treaty of Westphalia, concession to reality. But there is a way in which the administration of, I mean, and this I mean, I'd even say it goes way back. I mean, we talk about it with the Persians. It's just better in North Africa and in Central Asia. I think again it might partially be geographic because you kind of have to have your administrative ducks in a row in that region. There's a lot you got to keep up with, and there's a lot of different stuff to deal with. But it leads to both highly centralized but also regionally variant states. One of the interesting things I think is also that we could talk about, the other thing that makes it more stable, is the Islamicate world doesn't need to enforce total confessional hegemony in the same way that the Christian world does, even though the Christian world theoretically has a secular power administration unit separate from that. And I think that is something interesting to look at, because, I mean, for example, we talk about North Africa. Like, Christians were a majority population in North Africa for what, 600, 700, 800 years, depending on what you're talking about, after the conquest. It wasn't it wasn't automatic, and that also meant it wasn't genocidal, nor were they expelling massive amounts of Christians in the Europe. Trust me, we'd know if there were a bunch of cops in southern France.
Yes, that's right. Well, in fact, actually, that's a good point that you make there, is that really the Latin West is the specialist in what we might call expulsion of, populations that are religious dissidents and so on, like, both Jews, Muslims from Spain. You don't see that happening. You may have imperial movements of populations, but they don't expel them from their own polity and say, we can't integrate you and keep you as subjects. You have to leave. That's something that's pretty unique, you might say, to Europe's mode of dealing with religious difference. And you point to a big, I think, one of the things that I was alluding to essentially when I was saying that I do think Europe ends up going on its own particular trajectory, is one of the things, that it departs from what we might think of as the cosmopolitan Mediterranean system of dealing with ethno-religious, linguistic difference. Is you find forms and ways of accommodating these groups within. It's a hierarchy. It's not that, this toleration doesn't mean equality or enjoying the same civil kind of status. There's social hierarchies that are related to whether you're in the dominant ethnic or religious community. However, that hierarchy isn't so exclusionary that there isn't a place for you within the society. And this is a tension, it seems to me, that concept that I just mentioned of confessional empire, it creates two new potential problems that have to be resolved. Is if you have, kind of a universalist, religious kind of confessional, religious ideology that legitimizes the state, you now have two questions. What is the character of religious dissent from within that dominant religious community? What used to be thought of as just heresy as a theological problem or question for the religious specialists to work out and debate and come to some consensus and convene a council and so on, now becomes something that is of political significance, right? Heresy can be treachery. I mean, because if you have an official religion, then being a religious dissident now means that you are standing outside somehow the conventions of legitimate political power and authority as well. The second point is, what do you do with existing non-dominant religious communities? In the case of the Islamic world, what do you do with Zoroastrians, Hindus, Jews, Christians, Sabians? You've got a whole variety in the Near East.
Buddhists,
exactly. What are you going to do now with these groups that exist? They obviously, have to be dealt with, and there's different ways you can deal with them. One is incorporate them as subordinates, give them a certain kind of religious autonomy, but make sure that there's a religious hierarchy that, means that political power and military power is, monopolized by a particular religious community in some fashion. And we will see, of course, in the course of time, when you have the Turkicization and the Berberization of Muslim religious power in North Africa and in Central Islamic lands, that they also become ethnicized. And so even if you're a Muslim, if you're Arab or Persian, you're no longer now part of the military class and so on. So that can be, it isn't only a function of religion, but initially when you create these kind of ideologies and structures of confessional empires, you've got these two problems. What do you do with religious dissidents? That now become a political question, a political problem that has to be dealt with by the state or some intervention by the state. And secondly, how do you incorporate or not? So you could either say we need to expel these people, we need to forcibly convert them, or we can come up with some kind of form of accommodation. And that's what the Byzantines and the Muslim, the Arab Muslim, Islamicate powers end up doing. Whereas in medieval Europe, you start to have the development of a more exclusionary, form of religious identity that everybody, apart from the Jews, who move from being a kind of subordinate in the early medieval period along the lines of many of the other kind of subordinate religious communities. They are transformed. Some kind of process happens of exclusion that takes place where they are quarantined. They're seen as a threat to the fabric of Christian society, to the integrity of Christendom. And this is when you have the more violent forms of suppression, the attempts at forcible conversion. And this problem isn't just a question of the Jews, but because of conquests in the Mediterranean, whether it's the Crusader states, whether it's Sicily under the Latins, first under the Normans, but then also in Iberia with the so-called Reconquista, when you have in the 13th century, well, starting in 1086, but especially gaining momentum in the early 13th century with the 1214 victory at Las Navas de Tolosa. Most of the Muslims, who were in the Iberian Peninsula now fall as mass subordinate communities in Latin Christendom, and you have to deal with them, and which is why the Lateran Fourth Council, which in some ways is the most important council, church council of pre-modern history. Before Vatican II, this is probably the most important one, partly because it mandates confession for all believers. There's a universalist sort of idea. It almost makes you wonder, what did it mean to be a Christian in medieval France before 1215?
I have no idea, actually, the more I learn about the pre-Lateran Council stuff. I'm like, you lived under a Christian king. That's
right. Exactly. You lived in a Christian polity under Christian authority. It didn't mean necessarily that you had to go to church or that you had to go, to confession. This gets mandated in 1215 that at least once a year you have to go to confession and then do penitence. You have to attend mass, once, a year and do confession. And so this is an important church council that universalizes certain obligations for the laity. It also mandates all kinds of provisions for the suppression of heresy and what you can do to heretics, and how it's an obligation, to persecute heretics by Christian powers. They have to take this aggressive attempt to stamp it out. And it's also what legislates that Saracens, i.e. Muslims and Jews, have to wear distinctive clothing so that they can be marked out as separate from the rest of the Christian faithful and avoid the possibilities, for intermingling socially, sexually, and so on. Because intermarriage is impossible, but also sexual relations could be polluting the integrity and sanctity of the Christian community. And why was all this being done? Why do you have to reform the church, make the laity more religious, suppress heresy, and make sure that, these enemies of Christ, of Saracens and Jews aren't, subverting Christian unity, in various ways from within? Why? Is because the most important thing that was being developed was this was a crusade council. So they've had, 100 years, one initial victory that founds these Crusader states, but subsequent reversal after reversal, including, of course, the reconquest of Jerusalem under Saladin, the Fourth Crusade going awry, and in a sort of successful way, they conquer the Byzantine Empire, but they still didn't get Jerusalem back. There's a flagging, kind of sense that the Second, the Third, and the Fourth Crusades have been failures, and so Innocent III says, we need to reform society. God is not going to give us victory and, restore Jerusalem to us and allow Christianity to expand universally if we don't reform ourselves. And so it's a crusade council. And that's, I think, very important to recognize how significant and important the crusade process is. My thesis on it, and I'm actually working on a short book, The Formation of a Crusading Society, is to say that the transformation of Europe during the medieval, centuries, the 12th and the 13th centuries, really cannot be understood without integrating crusade and its consequences internally upon the Latin West in creating a sense of Christendom, which didn't really exist as a very defined concept before crusading becomes, a form of pious, holy, warfare before it starts being preached. Even what we were talking about before in terms of the integration of states and centralizing of states is that, how do you get past this feudal system where the nobles, they don't want to cooperate and, give you money. They see that as tribute. Conquered peoples give tribute and pay taxes. They're not going to do that. They offer their military service. However, they don't do it when you want it, for as long as you want it. They have their own ideas about, how and where they should conduct warfare and so on. It's difficult. What you want as a king is a mercenary standing army and the funds to pay them. This is what, creates a state. A state is when you can raise enough money to, support an army that's loyal to and dependent upon the sovereign, and not on this aristocracy that you have, a military, class that you have to, kind of negotiate with constantly, and doesn't want to recognize you as more than primus inter pares, first among equals. They don't want to concede to the state, all of these powers. Well, the one thing that enables kings to implement new forms of taxation and political power and authority, to convene war abroad, in ways where they have the support of the church as the only institutional apparatus that can kind of support them, is the crusade. So, the Saladin tithe, in England, they're able to raise enormous amounts of money because they get a tenth of income. Unprecedented, historic. Only the church gets a tenth. But the church said, yes, you can, because we've lost Jerusalem and we need to raise money, to support people to go on this third crusade. So we give you the concession that you can raise a tenth within your kingdom. Unbelievable amount of authority and power. And it was called the Saladin tithe. And you could say, death and taxes come from having to fight the Saracen. And this is so important for the history of state formation in the Latin West, that I think you can't ignore the importance and the significance of crusading for 200 years, almost continuously. We talk about like the second, third, fourth, these big crusades, but there were parties going, there were minor crusades, all throughout this period. I mean, it's really innumerable the number of times people went on military armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land in order to participate in expanding the Crusader states or trying to reconquer Jerusalem. That's 200 years of constant preaching, constant mobilization, of developments in the spiritual and the technical organization of society, that I think has been it's not that it's been overlooked in the sense that people didn't think it was significant or important, but they seldom integrated it into the idea of Europe's transformation, like how it transforms, how it becomes a functioning state system. And I think, understanding how the Muslim enemy and the pressure of this kind of foreign war and supporting a settler colonial enclave, on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean and the Levant, is absolutely vital. And to your point earlier, you mentioned, an economic analysis of it. Most of the Crusade scholarship has tried to shy away from, in modern times, an economic analysis of it, and emphasized how costly it was, and so that they were doing it as a sacrifice for religious, pious motivations. In fact, one of the great Crusade historians, the late Jonathan Riley Smith, whose work is foundational and very important for generations of historians, wrote a famous article called "Crusading as an Act of Love." Like, his whole point was this idea of caritas. It was for spiritual benefits. It was to help the Eastern Christians. They didn't do it for like land and and greed and all of that. So there was this kind of attempt to try and characterize this as this idealistic, spiritually significant, cultural, orientation in crusading. I think you have to kind of understand that, much like the geopolitics today, when you have Ansarullah cutting off trade in the Red Sea, that they were very interested in lines of trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean. They showed that they were interested in access. The Fourth Crusade was meant to actually attack Egypt. The Fifth Crusade actually invades Egypt. The Seventh Crusade by Louis IX attacks Egypt, just like the Fifth Crusade. So at a certain point, you have to kind of question, what is the geopolitical framework of the crusading interest in the Eastern Mediterranean? It's clearly not just recapture Jerusalem, but it's exercise domination on the eastern part of the Mediterranean and have access to the Red Sea and independent control over trade routes going into the Indian Ocean. And, they did the same, in Byzantium, it opens up the Black Sea. Why are the Genoese, trading in Kaffa? They're the biggest slavers of the Mediterranean world, and then become, Christopher Columbus becomes the, great, conqueror, discoverer. Why? He's a Genoese. They hire a Genoese because the Genoese know what it means to be involved in conquest, settler colonialism, and enslavement, in the Mediterranean world, from the Black Sea down to, the southern part of the Mediterranean. And this is what they're involved in. That's why they were so crucial also for the Crusader states, and provisioning them and supplying them and providing the maritime kind of support that was needed in order to sustain them as long as they were able to do so. Ultimately, in 1291, they fall. But that's 200 years where they're honing and perfecting and developing sugar plantations, enslavement, conquest and crusade. Is it any wonder that when they get into the Atlantic world, that they have all kinds of structures? My argument would be the Atlantic world is not new. Obviously, it's transformative. But they honed all kinds of techniques, institutional practices, knowledge and expertise in conflict in the Mediterranean world that then is taken, in the early modern period into the Atlantic world. And the Crusades are absolutely crucial, it seems to me, in the transformation that Europe undergoes.
Absolutely. Interestingly, that concept of the Mediterranean is like the round one for the transatlantic world. I want to come back to that. I'm going to stick a note in that because that's really important. And it's really important because when we see differences in the way the settler colonial states in the Americas play out in the transatlantic world, I think we do have to look at the way nation building and ethnogenesis in general. And for those of you who don't know, ethnogenesis is the anthropological term for when you create new ethnic groups. And creating new ethnic groups is interesting because if you believe national myths, you just think they're nations that speak a language that emerge out of the dirt somewhere. And we don't literally believe they emerge out of dirt anymore because we've now almost everybody agrees with singular human origins. But they used to literally believe that we emerged out of dirt somewhere. Just put a pin in that. But that these ethnicities emerge actually mutually constituted in contestation. And I like that you pointed out that this is not unique to the Christian world, but I do think there's some logics in the Latin West that kind of become, when you say the Lateran Council is super important and it's a Crusade Council, a lot of people, I have a friend of mine that I worked with, a Catholic friend of mine that I worked with when I lived in Egypt, and he would always make fun of me because he's like, "You're the only Marxist I know who always starts off, well, this all begins with the Crusades," and because he's like, every other Marxist I know talks about like it's all begins in the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
I'm like, no, it does not. But so I've been kind of not as articulate as you about it, but this has been my gut feeling too, that there was something in the Crusades and the creation of this idea of Christendom which really did not. I don't have a lot like you. I don't have a lot of strong evidence that it actually existed during the early medieval period. It just not just because no one even knows what it means to be a Christian. I mean, when you go, well, you accept the Nicene Creed. I'm like, yeah, but guys, most peasants never went to church before the 12th century.
Yeah.
Like they aren't accepting the Nicene Creed. They don't know what it is. They just know they're not supposed to worship the old gods anymore. Sort of.
Right.
You know, and
Worship the local saint instead.
Right. Yeah, you have local saints, which may or may not have the same names as the old gods, and like, you have these Catholic festivals on the holy calendar, but like, I mean, we could talk about what medieval parties were like, like, because they're a lot wilder than you think. So, so you have on that sense this ethnogenesis, but the Lateran Council seems to set up a logic that's going to immediately actually, because it forces confessional unity to an extreme extent. There's kind of two ways the Western Christendom can take it. One is actually kind of what the Latin Church ends up doing, and it's never occurred to me that this actually mirrors the Islamic world, which is just having a bunch of internal traditions that are quasi-separate, but not really. So, you had the Franciscans and the Jansenists and whatever. And I was thinking about, you have that in both mystical traditions and Sharia law jurisprudence courts in which hadiths do access. The Islamic world's already got that. Christian world kind of doesn't. So you have that answer. And then the other answer, however, which is the answer that basically England takes, is to enforce hegemony, but in doing so, you have to make the state stronger to do that. And it's got to be a fairly small state to have that kind of administrative power actually on this scale, because purging everybody from all of Europe is not going to happen. But you can probably do it on, half of an island.
Right. We're talking about pre-modern, techniques of governance. They don't have the surveillance capacities that we have, and ways of technical organization exactly of a modern surveillance state.
But they do have a Norman administrative system, and they do have a relatively small landmass that is separated by unpleasant channels of water. So you have this consolidation. The reason why I think this is interesting, once you combine that with so we bracket that, we see that developing in England. Let's come back. Let's go down to the Reconquista, and I'm going to start putting in quotation marks because it didn't reconquer crap. It's not like Castile was a Visigothic kingdom. So you have the Christianization of Spain. People have talked about the economic apparatuses of this. So these attempts to build confessional states, which were also tied to what ends up being proto-racial theories about the Roma, the Jews, and the Saracen/Moor, gets bloodetized, in, for lack of a better term, in New Spain, because they need to get all this. Yes, thank you. Yes, that would be the nice way, is let's Francify it. That makes it sound more less barbaric. So you have the persecution of new Christians. That literally creates my family, because we go into the Ottoman Empire and end up in Bulgaria, and then end up in the United States. But way back, in time kind of immemorial, we were in Spain. But that really is, you combine that, you get the first notions of blood race, really.
Yes.
Because Christendom and ethnicity and ethnic chauvinism, like ethnic chauvinism exists. There's flirtations with things what we might call proto blood race, even as early as like the 5th century in Rome, when things are going bad. Nonus starts talking about black people, but by black people, he actually means Indians on the subcontinent. He does not mean Africans. It's actually it's very weird. but that kind of actually goes away for another 1,000 years, roughly. But by the end of the Reconquista, you have that they really need money, and they can get it two ways. Well, we got this, and then we can like do what you said, take the G&E, send them out. We got these cool boats now. Let's send them out as far as we can send them, like to the other end of the trade route, so that we can bypass this new problem. Because we used to have an okay relationship with the Saracens, but they kind of hate us now because I don't know, 2 centuries of crusades, so they're not going to let us through anymore. I mean, that part of traditional historiography is true. I don't know whose fault that was. I'm being sarcastic for people who can't see me. So you also send all your new warlords out as conquistadors and all your great men out as conquistadors. To do that, you end up in New Spain. So you got the Portuguese and the Spanish, who now have this racial ideas that they've gotten from the Inquisition, which is caused by the Lateran Council. You have this need for ideological conformity, which you've always kind of had in Christianity, but never really had enforced, let's be honest. Even in the Roman period, I mean, in the classical Roman period, Christian Roman period, it was remarkably hard to enforce ideological consistency on Christians. And the more you read stuff like Boethius and stuff, like, no, there's still half pagans even there. So it's not as consistent even in, also the more people learn about Christian heresy, it should be like they didn't even agree if there's one God. Like, come on. Let's talk about archons and powers and principalities and stuff if we really want to get how weird that stuff actually was. Weird from our modern perspective anyway. But so you have a need for ideological conformity. You have these areas you can get it. You have this new, transatlantic slaver settler state, which is developed in the Mediterranean, really. Now you have a very, very big ocean and a very, very big landmass to put it on. And you can get rid of all your people. You don't need the Crusades anymore because now we can throw them out across the ocean far away.
Yes.
And let them do whatever. But why it matters for the settler colonies is I do think the Catholic response versus the Protestant response, in some ways, maybe my Catholic friends are gonna get real mad at me at this, but like I think Protestantism is like a logical extension of certain elements of Catholicism after the Lateran Council. And that is gonna lead towards statification, but like this unity and pluralism stuff that you see both in the Eastern Christian world and the Islamic world, you don't see in the Latin world. You kind of see it in the Catholic world in response to the Protestant world, because what you start seeing around the Council of the First Council of Trent is this realization, like, okay, we got to like go against this reform, but also maybe we need to have space for different diverse groups in this thing, so they don't all just become heretics and leave. Papal infallibility and some other stuff. Have a nice day. Bye. But as long as you believe in these things, some of which seem arbitrary to us, but we're gonna leave you alone. That's why you have for a while things like Jansenists who totally read like Calvinists, but they're Catholic. Whereas the Protestant churches, which I do think it is interesting that they're most successful in relatively strong but small states, the Dutch, the English, etc. They glom onto these racial ideas coming out of Portugal pretty hard, but unlike the model that you're seeing out of the Mediterranean, I think originally out of the Islamicate world and then into some of the Catholic world, where you have like the La Casta system, which is shitty, but it's not exterminationist. All right. Like, right. And doesn't even discourage intermarriage. Like, versus what you see in the Protestant settlers, who are almost always end up exterminationist because they don't encourage intermarriage. Ethnogenesis is stronger for them, and they've tied it to blood race now too. They now see pagans not just as culturally different. There's a battle and the kind of racism that's emerging in the Protestant world, where there's a group of racists who think it's cultural purely, and like, I mean, it even gets manifested in modern religions like Mormonism, where, like, well, if you like adopt our ways, you'll literally become white. Like, we think you'll literally just get whiter by our cultural practices. I don't know. We don't have scientific notions yet. You'll just get white.
That's so funny, because that reminds me of so many medieval conversion stories that are set in this Mediterranean world of religious and ethnic difference, where the Moor is like black, right? And and this also maybe symbolizes kind of their moral infidelity as well. And you have these cases in the actual stories where some kind of noble, Moorish prince, decides to convert to Christianity, and as a result, becomes white, actually like changes color in the story. Or you have the cases where mixed marriages are characterized as a figure, the resulting kind of offspring is half black and half white, like literally down the middle, or in Parzival, where they're speckled, they kind of still have, like leopard spots and so on. And so you have these kind of proto, racialized but pre-scientific racism, forms of trying to think through racial and ethnic difference. But the interesting and important thing is that, like religious identity, they are potentially malleable. You can change. What happens in the kind of modern scientific form of racism is that it's biologized in a way that can't be changed. So in some sense, these Mormons are, hearkening back to an older kind of idea, you might say.
Oh yeah, I do think that. I mean, one of the things I think in Mormonism, Mormonism is a weird melange of beliefs. I just happen to study it because I live in Utah. But you see these early, like, Protestant grapplings with this that get maintained in Mormonism that were kind of just folk theology and the rest of evangelicalism, and just kind of dropped because they weren't biblical. And whereas in Mormonism, where you have a prophet system, somewhat explicitly based on Islam. I mean, Joseph Smith actually talks positively about Muhammad. You can maintain these folk ways as revelation. And also, when they become a problem, you can revelate them away. Although, the Mormons didn't do that in like 1979. But nonetheless, you see these sort of wrestlings here. You also see that, like, in Mormonism, Curse of Ham stuff is maintained for a lot longer.
Yeah.
Which is a weird proto-racial theory. And I say this to say that it is not that these ethnogenesis were not going on in the non-Christian world. I've also pointed out that, like, well, secular Turkey did what the Ottomans could never do, which was actually make Turkey Muslim. So
by making all these people Turks,
right? Yeah, because what's the difference between a Greek and a Turk? A lot of stuff, but really it's religion. It's language.
Well, like in the former Yugoslavia. I mean, what's the difference between a Bosniak, a Croat, and a Serb? I mean, basically it's
religion.
Are you Orthodox, Catholic, or Muslim? I mean, that's basically the ethnicization of religious identity.
Right. But this brings me to why that, for people who go, well, why are you guys talking about stuff in the 12th century? Isn't this about right now? And I hope maybe people can start figuring out, with me tying it to the transatlantic world, that yes, it is about right now. There's a continuity here. And if anything, I have I have a couple of major critiques of Marx and Marxism, but this one's a big one. By accepting Smith's "Here be dragons" around Asiatic despotism, they did not study the political economy of most the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Luxembourg tried to fix this. Marx flirted with it at the very end of his life in the ethnological notebooks. So I can't say that by the end of his life he wasn't aware of it. And I'll give Marx credit. He's one of the people who in life seem to got less racist as they age, not more, which is actually kind of rare in history. But he was still wedded to a whole lot of German idealist conceptions that just bracketed all this stuff out almost entirely. And because of that, there's not a good understanding of the period before capitalism. And there's also not a good understanding basically of, I don't know, most of the planet. And in that sense, I do think Marxism accidentally, I don't think it's intentional, but accidentally ends up pretty Eurocentric despite trying not to be, because it doesn't look at these formation periods. Like Marx is being interested in medievalism. One seems weirdly be a British thing. I don't know what that's about. Because I do like there's a fair amount of British medievalist Marxist humanist kind of people, but there's not a lot of anybody else. And Soviet historiography didn't really help on this regard at all. And because of that, it means that Marxism actually doesn't have a good narrative for dealing with a lot actually the stuff going on in settler colonial world, or it takes nations as somehow like my critique of Jay Sakai is that he thinks races and nations are the same thing, and that they're actually kind of eternally there, always there. And I'm like, no, they're not. They're not. That's not how that works. So that's a problem in Marxism, I think, and this is something I think that why I think what you do at Guerrilla History is important, and at least today. The other reason why it's important is well, when the Islamic empires fell, which is remarkably late historically compared to like most other empires, except for the British, I guess, but they're a modern empire anyway. Trying to impose nation states on the former Islamic world is really hard and would lead. I think that's where something like when we were mentioning Perrin, to take us all the way back to the beginning. Well, he can't accept that because he's like, well, they don't take nation states, so they're not rationalizable. Because we all believe in this quasi-Marxist, definitely Weberian, like rationalization of the state from confession to whatever, and I think Perrin does too. And these Islamic polities, the peoples don't take to nation states very well at all because it's real hard to parse them. And it was all, I mean, the other thing that I should point out, it also was in Eastern Europe. Stalin just did a real good job of it.
Well, that's what I was going to say is that, we can say that it's a question, to frame it as the tragic consequences of attempting to impose the nation state form on Islamicate societies. But that misses the fact that, in a way, what we have to think about is that there are these land-based agrarian empires that have cosmopolitan and mixed populations that then don't resolve easily into this kind of formula of land, people, nation, state, And we see that with the, Russian Empire, the Soviet kind of system, that as a consequence of the fragmenting and transition of the Soviet Union into a whole set of independent nation states, and some that didn't get to be nation states who could conceivably have been and wanted to be, independent nation states in the post-92, post-91, 92 era, is that it has left kind of mixed population. You got all these Russians who were part of a system where they were working as scientists, engineers, administrators, doctors, whatever in Kazakhstan, But then when Kazakhstan becomes its own nation state that's supposed to be a Kazakh nation, now what do you do with these resented kind of minority populations that actually used to be probably among the dominant elite? So there's all kinds of, power dynamics. This is a recipe for, these disasters that we see. And I think it's broader than just, it's just the fact that I think the Middle East, the West Asia, is described historically, you might say, by large scale and rather multifarious forms of empire, of dynastic empire, um, that didn't map easily on territory. Compared to, say, China, which also has a long history of empire and of integrating various different peoples, but had certain kind of territorial, stability for at least a few hundred years, that it could make the transition into a kind of coherent state, perhaps. But you don't have that in the Middle East. And so the point I'm trying to make is just that it has such a long history of imperial formations of large scale. In fact, you might say, starting with Babylonia, Sumeria, the Akkadian, and then the Hittites, is you've got waves and waves of larger scale polities of certain ethnic dynastic groupings that ruled over very mixed and multifarious, variegated societies for thousands of years. We've had this kind of turn. So it doesn't translate very easily then into nation states. But the same could be said of imperial land-based agrarian structures like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like the Russian Empire. These did not succeed very well in moving smoothly from an imperial dynastic form where the variety of peoples redounded to the glory of the empire. It was a part of the testimony to how great this empire was, that it had so many different peoples. Now all of a sudden then these peoples are supposed to be nations, and they're supposed to express that nationhood in their own political form of the nation state. That's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and then you make it even weirder in the Marxist scenario when you say, and when you do this, we'll form you into an international, and we'll get over the nationalism we just created.
Right. Yeah.
Dr. Yaron Hanez is Dr. Harun Yanez, excuse me, I flipped his has very good about Marxists thought dialectically this would happen. Perhaps they should deal with the fact that the latter part does not happen.
Right.
There is no reason to believe that once you instantiate national thinking in areas where it wasn't before, that people can just, adopt it, decentralize, re-centralize, and then come back together without the resentments created by said nationalisms. And I do think that's a problem, and I do think it's become a real problem in Marxism. It makes it very hard for Marxists to often see the results of what they're going to do. And I'll give you an example of that that's very prescient to us today: Stalin and Israel. In the idea, in the idea, and this is one of the things that I guess I get in fight another leftist with, that I think Palestinian nationalism is totally valid, as any nationalism is, more than quite a few of them actually, but we should admit that it's modern, that settler colonial policies actually separated the Palestinians out from the other Levantine Arabs otherwise. And that's not just true for Palestine. It's also true for Lebanon. It's also true for Syria. And that it's, I don't know, kind of a disaster that we can cynically use for proxy wars in the case of Syria in particular, and to a certain degree Lebanon. And will probably lead to genocide unless we have active frameworks for dealing with it in the case of Palestine, and particularly in Gaza. When I say lead to genocide, I mean lead to successful genocide.
Yeah.
I want to be clear. I think a genocide is being attempted. Um, that I find it weird that.
Well, that's why, I mean, just to kind of pick up on that, that's why, although, national liberation movements as anti colonial resistance historically took on this form of nationalism, that actually, I mean, does create its own problems dialectically, as I think you're mentioning. But that's partly why I think if we're looking forward to the shape of the struggle, it's partly in some ways a healthy realization that the two-state solution doesn't really have that much legitimacy among Palestinians anymore. I take that as an index for the idea of nationalism um, being superseded, perhaps in some ways, by a healthier commitment to freedom, human rights and political rights more broadly than framing it around national self-determination. The people need to have, their human rights respected. They need to be accorded full civic rights. The form in which that takes doesn't have to be a particular state that is exclusively representative of a particular nation as defined, because those are pretty artificial constructs. And while it has developed reality through the course of resistance and struggle, I think subsequent generations feel increasingly committed more to you know achieving justice and full political rights than it having to take the shape of Palestinian nationalism as an exclusivist response to Zionism as a form of Jewish nationalism. And that actually could be very healthy, um, as a as again a progressive struggle towards where the rest of the world also needs to go. Like, this is part of the reason why I think the struggle for Palestine and against settler colonialism is so crucial. Partly because what's being pitted is, uh, something like resistance of the global South to this hegemonic surveillance, militarized, security state that Israel sort of represents and markets its sort of techniques of exclusion, social control, surveillance, and militarized borders, is something that is very valuable for Europe, for the U.S., right? So I think,
honestly, even for China and Russia, if we could be.
well, certainly. I mean, well, that's the point, is that in a way, it's a model that could be globalized. It is globalizing. And in some ways, it's important that a different model of, how we could live be promoted. And I really do feel that there are some elements in the Palestinian struggle that are moving towards getting beyond some of the narrow nationalist affiliations of previous generations into a broader kind of sense of human rights and political rights that would be easier to integrate the region together if it was successful. So that's why we have to hope that it is a successful struggle.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think I've been thinking a lot about, people think I'm a critic of multipolarity, and I've told people like it's like criticizing rain. It's like that's not what I mean. Um, but I do think that if your view of the multipolar future is basically big nation states with clusters of little nation states, a la the political map of the 19th century, but with nuclear weapons, yay.
Yeah.
That's a disaster.
Indeed.
But also, like, I do not want to go back to uh nation, the unipolar nation state hierarchy of the rules-based international order,
Mhm.
of the transatlantic super state, and we're going to have to figure that out. And one of the things is, I mean, one of the answers is right now is that because of, and I want to say this, when people are stressed, they go to the image of whatever their proxy for kinship is, frankly, that is easiest for them. And right now, the dominant one of the last 300 years is the nation state, because most of the other international things ended up looking imperial, and no one wants that anymore, rightly. And unfortunately, there are kind of two global orders in the world. What I mean is there's global religious orders, which are not very powerful, but they exist. And there's the capitalist global order, and then there's like, there's internationals, but not really, like, not after the fall of the Soviet Union in any meaningful sense. And I think we really do have to look towards the past. Like, it's not like I'm saying, oh, we need an ancient form of confessional empire. I think that would be a disaster.
Bring back the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, it's just like, make Byzantine great, Byzantium great,
Right, exactly.
weird stuff like that. Or neo-Habsburgism or some kind of hyper-reactionary thing like that. But I do think I was trying to explain, and I've been doing this long reading series on the right because I'm a former right winger, and I'm good at. I've read a lot of this stuff, and I've been reading Alexander Dugin, who I think gets way too much credit in the West anyway. But I've been reading him, and yeah, I was trying to explain, like, look, if you look at the problems of globalization right now, this is reactionary, philosophy. Do not misunderstand me. And when leftists buy into it, they're betraying themselves. However, if you look at what it's responding to and what the left court has not been able to respond to, because it really doesn't deal with anything before the Industrial Revolution, really.
Right.
This seems pretty attractive, all right, and does seem to speak to some real problems that, say, Marxism and definitely liberalism have had trouble addressing. We can either start taking a longer Duree view of the development of these systems and trying to learn from them, and not be outflanked by someone as banal as Francis fucking Fukuyama. And I don't mean that in the people always think I'm referring to the End of History book. I'm actually referring to his Political Order and Political Decay books, which I actually think leftists should read, because he does try to, I don't know, talk about the stuff that we're talking about in the construction of the liberal West, going all the way back to like the 12th century, which I wish a Marxist would do in a serious way these days. And it matters for trying to come up with a solution to Palestine that is not ethnic cleansing. And a solution to the end of settler colonialism that doesn't end up in ethnic cleansing. Because if you try to impose, like, and this is one of the bad faith arguments against, say, like Landback or whatever, is that it's all just blood and soil nationalism, right? It's not. But if you impose blood and soil nationalism on it, all it's going to seem like is revenge. And actually a very small part of the population depopulating the majority of the population of most of the physical landmass of the planet, which is a non-viable thing. I don't think that's what any indigenous person means. I don't even think that's what Jay Sakai meant, even if you can't tell from his book. And that means that we have to have a better framework for dealing with this than nationalism. And I'm just going to also add, and also, can we stop it with the French laicism for a minute? Because while I'm not against secularity in the sense of I would prefer the state to leave people's religions alone at this point, for reasons of we live in multi-confessional worlds of highly intermixed populations, and that ain't changing anytime real soon. I also think trying to do that by enforcing secularity the way that, say, the French try to enforce it, and sometimes the English and the Americans try to force it, asterisk, this is one of the few things where the French are worse, but unasterisk.
Mhm.
Um, we end up creating enemies we do not need, and misunderstanding the nature of the way race, nation, and class have worked in a way in which um, I think creates major problems for the liberation of the world. And another example of that is Palestine.
Mhm.
Like, um, if you try to read Palestine through the lens of, I don't know, the worst statement Hamas ever made in 1987, like, yeah, that document sucks. Um, then you're really not offering a way out of what looks like it's going to be an ethnic cleansing, a genocide. I mean, at least for the Gazans. Um, and you're also not offering a way out of zero-sum relations for, say, Mizrahi Jews who
Mhm.
don't have
Mhm.
another place to go back to. So
Yeah.
this is something that you really have to break out of the national framework to deal with. But I think to do that, you kind of have to understand how we got there. And to do that, I do think we have to look at the Mediterranean world, because like the subcontinent world and the Chinese world, those are big empires that are multi-ethnic. They have been forever. Trying to read them as nation states was something that Mao and Sun Yat-sen tried to do. I think it was actually probably a bad idea. um, uh, Nonetheless, like it's a different set of conditions. I don't see us imposing. I mean, obviously, I don't think it's going to go good anywhere. It's not going good in Eastern Europe either. Where like,
Right.
I mean, I was trying to tell someone, one of the ironies of the places that have like clear, coherent nation states is we're all like sick of them already. Whereas with these places where we have tried to impose it but made it kind of sexy, it's now a real problem, and we get to see the ugly parts of it again in real time, and it's real ugly. Um, and I do think if you look at the formation of our national units out of the Mediterranean and what happened in the particular case of the Latin Christian West and all that, you can really see how this started, and I um and then why it was kind of reified in the 19th and 20th century, because that's the
Mhm.
other thing.
Mhm.
Like Europe, even though it dominated the world, is real insecure about the fact that it's basically the dangly bits off Asia, and kind of always has been. Um, and that does not make anyone real happy. So, um,
Right. Right. I think you're, it's a lot in those remarks about how and why a longer historical perspective could be salient in this time on so many different fronts. And of course, I completely agree with that. I don't want to reduce things to, trans historical processes, that started 1,000 years ago. But I do think that it does give you a healthy sense of how constructed certain of the foundations upon which we're building our current politics and world are, flimsy constructs, of and products of this history. So if we can kind of think, I mean, one of the things that you were pointing out is in some ways that what Mediterranean history allows us to see when we study it over a long period of time is how much kind of movement, migration, interaction, interdependence um, is just a natural part of it. And it doesn't mean that those processes happened without conflicts. History always has conflicts because people are contesting, power, resources, precedence in all of these processes. But um, when you look at something like the emergence of far right politics across Europe as a reaction, just as you were saying, as a reaction to failures of liberalism, the fact that Marxism has not adapted successfully enough to perhaps encompass some of these other concerns and considerations in the, kind of era of late nation states, is how much the migrant crisis, created the opportunities here for extreme far-right exclusionary sorts of politics, partly because people just could not understand and accept the idea that dislocations and problems taking place because of wars and interventions and economic arrangements that proved unsustainable have always led to movements and migrations of people throughout the Mediterranean world, and to simply erect this kind of fortress Europe, make the Mediterranean a kind of hostile borderlands, is only to go back to Peren in the era of a colonial racist Orientalism that itself is incorrect history. He got it wrong. It's not that there aren't some important insights, to come back to the beginning of our conversation. It's not that there aren't important insights, that history is dialectical. And so there are consequences to, reshaping the way in which the Latin West comes to be integrated into the wider Mediterranean and Eurasian economic world, economic and political and social and cultural world. But they're just not on the basis and for the reasons that he imagined fictively by fantasizing that the mere religious difference of others, even though the structures of these religions are very similar, they have so many points of kind of contact and common origins and so on. The cultural dividing line of religion, religious culture, prevented him from being able to recognize and see the interdependence of these regions on one another, and that what happened was just that there was a shift or a change in the way in which Europe came to be integrated as a region within the system that impelled it to develop along particular sorts of lines. So having a kind of longer sense of history and being able to recognize some of these patterns should help us actually sidestep the terms under which we frame a lot of our contemporary political disputes and discussions. And I think it's very healthy if, we can re-energize a kind of Marxist materialist analysis that can still take into account aspects of these kind of cultural formations that develop over long periods of time, and think about like our common origins of modernity, not just as, one particular phase of a particular form of capitalism, industrial capitalism that takes place in Europe at a certain period of time, without incorporating the larger global realities of which it's a part, and the longer period of economic and social development, where you could say there are capitalisms, that are taking there are world systems that are integrating, that have aspects of what we think of as capitalism. It's just that, if you universalize from a distinctive European experience, this is the problem with, not doing global history. If you universalize from Europe's particular and distinctive experience, you're then missing, the other pathways that the other parts of the world are on. And it means that, you end up imposing solutions that are not going to be organic and that create their own new forms of conflict. And that's what we're wrestling with today, I think, so much in terms of post-colonial legacies of nation states throughout, Africa, West Asia, and even, as you were pointing out, Eastern Europe. So I think it's healthy to kind of think about this longer period of history to kind of re-energize our materialist Marxist analysis, and maybe that will help us actually not only find and envision solutions, but also have something to contribute in plain spoken ways in political discourse where it's absolutely crucial and necessary because people are retreating, in this kind of confusing, changing world, are retreating to, right wing, truths and verities as they imagine them, that have a kind of long history behind them. And that gives them a kind of sense of authority and authenticity. When people are struggling for meaning in a very confusing and changing world. So we have to kind of resurrect these histories to give a different kind of analysis, so that people don't feel like they're totally unmoored as we go forward in ways in which they can struggle for justice and they can struggle for equality and freedom, without having to rely upon exclusionary, forms of identity and political forms.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good place to stop off on, and people will know that I definitely plan on doing more shows with you in the future because I like talking 12th century history. If people don't know, because I don't talk about it enough on the show, but unfortunately, you guys don't listen to it enough either. No shame, audience. No shame. So if people want to educate themselves on historical things, of which you do a lot of, where can they find you work?
Well, they can find me on Twitter, and you can find out about all the things I do there at Adnan A. Husain, Husain. But you can check out Guerrilla History Podcast, Guerrilla, 2 R's, 2 L's. And I also have another podcast that's a little more occasional and related to the Middle East, Islamic world, and Muslim diasporas, but you might be interested in it as well. It's called The Majlis, Majlis. And both of those, Guerrilla History and The Majlis, are, on all the usual platforms.
Yep. Thank you so much. And I would endorse both those podcasts. I really like Guerrilla History. And also, people, just study history more. I mean, you can't be a historical materialist if you don't study history. I'm sorry, it's definitionally impossible. It's in the name. So on that note, we're going to end.